Synopsis. In a cold, retributive state where usefulness is measured in output and injury is a sentence, Nora Alvarez has been dismissed as deadweight, a logistics clerk with a crooked ankle and a past she is not allowed to speak of. When a crisis forces the military to requisition civilian convoys, Nora volunteers for a mission no one trusts her to survive. At the Central Command, the hardened General Victor Corin freezes at the sight of a tattoo on Nora's forearm, a tiny, hand-stitched symbol the regime calls a K*LL code, relic of a clandestine program that could end a war or trigger a massacre. That moment cracks open both men's histories. What follows is a tense, cinematic confrontation of guilt, loyalty, and the human cost of orders. Nora must use the only thing left to her, memory, courage, and the enigmatic mark on her skin, to prevent a slaughter and force a general to decide whether to obey the machinery of war or to listen to the voice he buried. The story is a study of redemption, the stubbornness of the living, and how a single symbol can collapse a lifetime of lies. She had learned early that the world would hand you a label if you let it. The state's forms were precise as a surgeon's scalpel: name, rank, unit, injury. A blank line where some other people had living histories. Nora's sheet read Nora Alvarez, logistics, incapacitated, Loaling. In the gray morning light of the supply depot, the label hung from her shoulders like a coat that did not fit, too large in the chest, cuffed at the wrists. "You sit it out today," Elias said, not unkindly. He was the kind of man who kept kindness in jars for when it might be needed. His hair was salt, his voice low. He had been the one to sneak her a cup of coffee the week she learned what deadweight meant in administrative language. "That isn't my job," Nora said. Her ankle throbbed, a slow drumbeat under the skin. It never stopped reminding her that the world's definitions had a way of finding the soft place and settling there to stay. She flexed the foot the way farmers ease sore limbs, gentle, deliberate. The pain was a ledger she could balance. If the convoys are short, someone has to go through the northern pass. The army wants 3 trucks and 2 drivers. They scheduled men on the eligible list. "I can drive." A pitying smile, the kind that the bureaucracy used instead of answers, flickered across the faces of the officers who passed. They looked at her the way one looks at a broken tool, necessary for a while, then disposed of. That morning the depot smelled of diesel and rain, the iron tang of open crates, and something else, the precise, antiseptic smell of strategy, of people arranging themselves into forms for war the way priests arrange candles before congregation. Elias allowed her a moment, watching the way she positioned her weight when she stood. "You'll only get 2 hours out there before the pain takes you. You'll be behind the wheel with numbness like a fog. What if you stole the convoy? What if? What if I don't?" She met his gaze. There was a tiredness in her that should have been softness, but it had sharpened into a blade. "If not me, then who?" He opened his mouth. Somewhere behind him, the depot's loudspeaker croaked the list of requisitions, the same litany repeated by men who trusted repetition more than change. Numbers, trucks, coordinates. Elias closed his mouth and nodded once, the smallest of concessions. She left with the convoy at midday, one hand on the wheel, 3 truck beds behind them stacked with crates stamped with the indifferent letterhead of the State Provision Bureau. The northern pass was a wound in the land, a scar of broken asphalt and runaway trucks. The road climbed into a place where the wind had learned to sharpen itself into decisions. Rain began as a whispering, then a whip. The convoy moved in a single, hunched line like animals in a migration, their lights dull. Nora's ankles sang with each turn, annulled him in a new language. She knew every way a truck could die: a blown suspension, a treacherous bend, a sudden slide into the ravine that slept like a patient thing beside the road. She also knew the way men could die under orders, the orders that arrived folded in crisp envelopes from the top echelons of the city, stamped with a seal that meant execute. She had seen trembling hands pass such envelopes across tables. She had read lists in the dim of night. Those lists were different from the supply manifests. Those were names wrapped in deadlines. The rain turned thick then, drumming like a conspiracy. Lights flashed, blue, then red, and a line of men in black pressed from the ditch at the edge of the road. Their vests read military police, and behind them they carried paper that smelled of power. "Hold," the officer called, his voice dry like paper. He stepped between Nora and the rest of the convoy and read aloud, General's requisition for immediate relief. All convoy personnel to report to command for verification. The general's requisition felt like a hand on the throat of the road. Nora's stomach folded in an old familiar way. Being called and meant more eyes on you, more questions. She could see the others' faces, their mouths hearts of iron beating faster than the rulebook allowed. Elias swore softly under his breath. Mara, a recruit barely 20, clutched the edge of her jacket and looked at Nora with something like worship and fear braided together. How quickly the young gave themselves to those they thought unbreakable. At command, the building was a block of glass and concrete that reflected the sky's unease. Soldiers passed through its revolving doors with the indifferent shuffle of people carrying conscience in their pockets. Nora had been inside before, once in a different life when she had moved between supply depots like a ghost in the system, collecting and leaving behind accounts not meant to be kept. Once means a long time ago. Now the walls smelled of coffee and strategy, and the linoleum hummed. The waiting room held a dozen people. Papers shuffled. An officer with a ribbon trotted toward the general's anteroom and disappeared. When the doors opened and he stepped out, the line parted reflexively like the sea around a standing stone. General Victor Corin entered like a cliff, slow, inevitable, watched. He was a man still lit by battles he had won and haunted by some he had not. His uniform was the map of his life, medals placed like constellations. The room felt quieter. The air tightened the way a string does before it sings. Nora had seen him in photographs and on the news, a jaw like a chiseled ridge, eyes that reached the end of a lake and refused to sink. In person he was smaller than in the grainy pictures, but the gravity around him was a thing that could be measured in seconds, the pause between heartbeats, the intake of breath when a switch unthreaded. He moved toward them, and at the same time as protocol unfolded, salutes, introductions, Nora felt the world narrow to the curve of her wrist. Elias, professional, careful, made the introductions. General, these are the convoy personnel. Nora Alvarez is the driver of Truck 3. Corin stopped in front of her, only a step away. For a second the room contracted. He looked at her boot, noted the limp the way a surgeon notes a scar. His face did not show pity, it metabolized facts. Miss Alvarez, he said, formal and cold. Then, he stared for a fraction too long, as if something in the minutiae of her hand held the answer to a question he had never known how to ask. A hawk could have found a nest in the way he looked. Nora followed his gaze to the inside of her forearm, the place where the skin was a map composed of lines, a constellation of 3 small marks. She had been careful about that mark for years. It was only visible when she turned her wrist to show someone a paper, as she now did to sign the verification forms. The tattoo was small, a shorthand, a triangle with a dot at its center, and a single horizontal line beneath it. She had drawn it herself in a do-it-yourself clinic with ink that tasted faintly metallic and dreamlike, a private thing carved into a life that the state tried to smooth into statistics. For a breath 1,000 years passed. General Corin's hand rose without permission of thought, and came to rest behind his ear, as if to brace his skull from an internal storm. His pupils had thinned to the pinhole of someone who had seen too much sun. The medals on his chest was suddenly a garland around a man who had been at sea too long. Nora, Elias said, voice measured. That is. Corin's lips moved. He made a sound the room had not heard in a long time, a single word, raw and impossible to place. Requiem. The room contracted further. If Nora had been the tide, she would have receded from herself at that sound. The mark she had worn for so long, a folding in the skin like a memory, had a name. Requiem. The unit the whispers had been about. The program the state pretended not to notice except in the way it sent men home without names or with names stamped onto grave markers. Requiem had been both legend and cautionary tale. Elite operatives who carried out surgical strikes, who removed threats with a clarity that left no second guessing. They were stories told in bars to steady hands that would later sign kill orders. They were rumored to use marks, signatures, tattoos, for recognition, like family crests for killers. Nora had not anticipated the word. She had never said it aloud to anyone. She had not chosen the mark to be a flag for legends. She had chosen it because the shape had steadied her palm the night she had taught herself to stitch a seam. She had drawn lines over grief and called them armor. General Corin's jaw had locked. For the first time, Nora saw his control clash with something in him that was not businesslike. He shifted his feet like a man balancing a dangerous animal. "You. Weren't you in the north, General?" Elias blurted. Then he covered his mouth with his hand as if to smother a thought. "You commanded the 6th in the old winter offensive." It was a question and a plea at once. Corin's hand. He kept it at his ear, like a radio clicking. The metals did not move. "That was decades ago," he said finally, a brittle thing. But the room had already been altered. Whispers leached into the corners. Mara, ever hungry for stories, watched Nora as if the woman were an actor who had stepped on stage and removed her mask. "You were Requiem," Nora said. Quiet, a tone meant for one person and not for the chorus of officers who now leaned in. No one taught her the words. They had lived in the sterile, dishonest air of command, waiting for someone else to give them life. When she said it, it felt like a match struck in a dark hole. Corin looked like a man who had been slapped by memory. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he breathed in, and with that breath something in him unlatched. "Yes," he said at last. The single syllable landed with the weight of a confession. It was not an apology. It was a recognition. "I was in command." "But that does not." He stared at the mark on Nora's skin as if reading scripture in a language he'd half remembered. The rest of his face remained a map of iron. The verification forms lay on the table like white flags. The officers shuffled papers. Elias cleared his throat and tried to put the moment back into neat boxes. But in the ripple the general had left, something else unmoored itself, the way a ship unmoors at the sound of an unnameable thing. Corin's eyes, for a fraction, landed on Nora not like a sovereign inspecting a subject, but like a man who had been shown a photograph of himself young and expected. He told them that the convoy would continue. He signed the forms with a hand that trembled invisibly. He asked Nora to accompany him back to command after the reassignment had been handled. His voice was a landscape of authority trying to disguise a tremor. They rode in silence to the inner offices. The corridors smelled of lemon polish and old decision-making, of people laying out futures on long wooden tables, and then being surprised when futures sat up and demanded different shapes. The general's private office was spare, the way a place that holds power must be. Clean lines, one heavy leather chair, a small shelf of books that had never been opened. "You have Requiem's mark," he said suddenly, not as a question, but as an accusation that had been waiting a long time. "You're the first to say it out loud," Nora replied. She folded her hands. The room offered itself to emotion, like a blank page to handwriting. "Why does it matter?" Corin's jaw worked. He had a soldier's expertise in keeping himself smooth, but the edges of him wore like an old coat. Because Requiem. Those operatives did not leave many records. They left actions. They were efficient. They solved impossible problems. They disappeared when the work was done. They were ghosts that served a state that forgot them when they were no longer useful. "You mean they were killed," Nora said, "or disappeared, or skinned of identity and put under other names?" Corin's eyes hardened with a truth that did not need speaking. "That is how such instruments are handled." She stared at him, the memories unspooled, and she did not stop them. "You ordered a purge, didn't you? The winter offensive. Orders came from command. Neutralize remaining dissidents in the northern sector. The lists were long as prayers. I read them. I signed for supplies. I thought the lists were censuses. I signed." "You were a logistics clerk," Corin said. His words were the brittle recoiling of a man trying to place blame without cracking what had been made of him. "You were not in command." No, she turned her forearm, so the mark showed. The little triangle and the dot and the line looked naked under the office light, an absurdly small thing to hold a history. "But I knew Requiem. I knew what their symbol meant on a manifest." Corin's face did something like a map dissolving into water. "You knew them." "I met them on the far side of the pass," she said. "I was 17. Someone, gave me shelter in a camp. They were closing in. They made decisions." Corin's mouth curled, not in a smile but in an expression almost like grief. "We all were young once," he said. "Young, stupid, full of righteousness. We thought we could fix the country by removing poison." "They removed people," Nora said. The words were steady as a surgeon's forceps. They called it mercy. Corin's hands found the desk's edge. Some of those decisions saved lives, he said. At least we told ourselves that, at the time. And some of them ended lives because they wore uniforms with nice medals, Nora said. You wanted a tidy ledger. You wanted an enemy to point at. Requiem made the ledger possible. There was silence between them as if a clock had stopped. Outside, the city moved with the ignorant competence of people who had not yet learned to fear their own names. Inside, the office contained a quiet like a held breath. Corin's face, that hard-edged terrain, was suddenly mapped with the small fissures of a man who had not altogether forgiven himself. You carry our mark, he said softly. Why? Nora thought of the night she learned to stitch. She thought of the seam that had held her mother's coat together, of cold hands and the shivering smallness of human things. She had been 17 when they put the mark into her skin, not precisely a tattoo in the old showy way, but a sign, an identity in a world that needed one. The people who wore that mark were efficient with death. They were not monsters. They were people who had been given a problem and told to solve it with tools they did not always choose. I was young, she said. I was part of a program. I was given an order. We believed in the ends because we were told the means were clean. Corin's thumb tapped the desk in tiny, nervous moss. Requiem operatives were trained to obey until there was no more to be had. They were efficient because they had no family left to call them home. They had nothing to lose. They were given a name, and that name was their only inheritance. You forget the faces, Nora said, until one day you see them again. She looked at him. You say to the ledger, the lives saved versus the lives taken. You say, necessary. But which ledger included your losses? General? Which ledger had your daughter on it? His hand stilled. The tautness in the office became a tautness in his throat. My daughter, he began, and then did not finish. Corin had built an empire of resolutions. One of those resolutions had been to shut the hinges of his heart when the army needed him. He had believed the irony of his own sacrifice was part of the price of peace. No man likes to think his loss is a statistic. You knew someone who wore the mark, Nora said. You froze when you saw mine because it reminded you. Corin's eyes moved. For a moment he was a boy again, not a general, and he wore his uniform like a borrowed skin. She had a scar across her thumb, he said. A little triangle drawn to hide it. They told us it was a safety marking, a joke among apprentices. Then the winters took things. The mark is the same, Nora said. But marks travel. People move. They are not always who you remember. The phone on his desk vibrated and he let it buzz against his palm. It was a simple, mechanical life insisting on its rhythms. The general put the device away and said, orders have come down. A refugee cluster near the Northern Valley is to be relocated immediately. There are reports of insurgent gatherings. Standard procedure is to cordon and clear. That is a massacre, Nora said, the words leaving her like stones cast into water. Corin's jaw hardened into its habitual sky. We will follow protocol. You follow protocol and people die, Elias said, stepping forward for the first time, his voice quiet and warm but firm. He balanced professionalism and the sudden taste of moral urgency like a man handling lightning. There are civilians there, families, suppliers. We sever supply lines and our own people starve. We call it military necessity, but we are not immune to the cost. Corin's eyes stayed on Nora. The triangle on her arm, a small mark, had made a canyon of decisions. He could give the order to clear the camp and with a stamp of paper write the names of men, women, and children into the ledger of necessary violence. Or he could listen to a woman the system called Deadweight and feel the tug of something softer. You were labeled Deadweight, he said finally, and there was no accusation in the words, there was only pity. Pity can be as cutting as any blade. Because you were injured and not useful. Because the system measured you in output. You measure usefulness in lives, Nora said. Not dollars or trucks. Lives. The general stood, and the room took notice. He folded his hands behind his back, as if to restrain them. I will send a detachment to the valley, he said. I will authorize a sweep. A sweep is a euphemism, Nora said. It is a way to call the killing clean. He turned and stared out at the city. At the window was a panorama of blocks and light, of little lights clipped together like a garland on a giant's neck. For a moment he looked as though he could see the people behind the lights, could imagine them breathing. Then his face hardened again. "Your presence here complicates things," he said. "Especially if stories, if rumors, begin to carry." "What do you mean?" Elias asked. "Rumors," Corin said, "that Requiem is active again. That someone carries their mark in the open. That the operative program never died." His voice became businesslike again. He had been a man schooled in the careful economy of fear. "Rumors are combustible. If the public believes Requiem conducts unsanctioned operations, there will be panic." "Then let them know we act for the people," Elias said. Corin looked at Nora like a man who had been asked to recall a childhood horror and might be asked to go back in to save something. "I will send scouts," he said. "No heavy ordnance. No indiscriminate action. I want you to go with them as a liaison." Nora's mouth had already moved. "I want a guarantee there will be no firing unless fired upon," she said. "And no arrests without warrants. And no executions under the guise of emergency." Corin studied her. He could have refused. He could have weighed his options and chosen the path that preserved his ledger. He was a man who had known how to compartmentalize the consequences of decisions. He knew, instinctively and precisely, the power of procedural distance. Yet something had changed. A small worn thing had been brought into the light, and had found a fault line. "All right," he said. "You will go. But you must understand, you are under my command for the duration of the operation." She left the office with a detachment that smelled faintly of disinfectant and resolve. The road to the valley unrolled green and indifferent beneath the wheels. The scouts were young men with tight jaws and the wrong kind of certainty. Mara rode in the cab with Nora, chewing at a lip as young people do to steady themselves. Elias's eyes lingered on Nora in a way that was asked for and forbidden, as if to measure the courage one was expected to pay to go on a mission whose real value could not be computed. They came upon the cluster at dusk. Tents sat like a constellation of small fortunes on the flanks of the valley, lit by lamps that looked like fireflies. Children ran in the dust, their feet bare and quick. Some of the tents had been repaired with bits of blue tarpaulin and ingenuity. One had a string of shell casings fixed as a wind chime. Women fried something on a pan, the smell mixing strangely with diesel and the faint smell of fay. Nora felt the hammering of her pulse, like a metronome. They established a perimeter. Scouts weaved among the tents to catalogue, to ask, to listen. The soldiers were careful, their orders were careful. It all felt like a play rehearsed for the possibility of something humane. They had been there an hour when shouting began. From the far side of the cluster, men in darker clothes gathered like a storm front. The scouts called it a protest at first, a pushing against the edges. Then voices rose into chant. The young men carried banners that were ragged patches of color. They shook their fists. They had eyes that were not afraid. A soldier slipped, his foot catching on a root. A crate toppled and crashed. Sound like a gunshot in the valley's hush. Someone, a boy of 20, an eager thing in a uniform, shouted a command that had nowhere to go. A dog barked. The chants turned into shouts. Another soldier thought he saw a rifle gleam under a tarp and aimed reflexively. Time can be a measure of 10,000 small things. The interval in which fear catches, the breath between a man's eye finding a target and his finger finding a trigger. Nora remembered when she was taught to kill, how the mind narrows into the seam of the task, how everything else becomes background. She had not wanted those lessons, but she had learned them like one learns to drag a net through water. "Hold," she shouted, voice through the radio and the air. Her voice was not a command. It was a friction against the move toward violence. Mara's eyes were wide and raw. The scouts hesitated, the muscles of intention relaxing with the time it took to listen. The leader of the ragged men, older, with hair like dried wheat, looked at Nora as if expecting a trick. He looked at the soldiers as if seeing children who had been told to hold a toy, and then not allowed to play. "Who authorized you to be a liaison?" he demanded. "General Corin," Nora said. "We have orders to ensure the relocation is humane." "Relocation," he spat. He pointed at the tents. "Relocation is a lie." It would have been easy for a soldier somewhere in the back to misinterpret the point as an excuse and pull a trigger. It would have been easy for the detachment's discipline to break. It would have been easy, and easy deaths are the ones that the ledger loves. Instead, as the tension peaked and the boy in the uniform's hand trembled above the rifle, General Corrin's silhouette moved into the line of sight. He had come, the way gravity moves, silent until you notice the absence of something expected. He had the calm of a man who has been inside chambers where the most brutal decisions are made and has learned to make them without show. He stepped forward, flat palms raised, the universal sign of someone who needs to be heard. "Nora," he called. His voice had the peculiar quality of someone whose authority had been tempered by remorse. "Step back." She did not step back. "No," she said, and there was a resolution like flint in her jaw. "We don't sweep them. We negotiate. No firing unless fired upon, General." He looked at her. The smallest of smiles, so small it might have been imagined, passed over his face. "You become very bold for someone they call Deadweight." "I'm more dangerous than my label," she said. "I know how you think. I know the way you make decisions. I was Requiem. I know the wording of a clean order." Corrin's face went still in an attendance to something private. Then he turned to the crowd. He disrobed authority like a cloak and became, for the span of a moment, not the general but an older man who had come to stand where consequences met the living. He spoke, not with the cadence of a commander who expects obedience, but with the cadence of someone who had been allowed the luxury of saying true things. "There will be a hearing," he said. "There will be an inquiry. No one will be removed from their tents tonight. We will draw up lists for evacuation by need. We will not use heavy ordnance. If insurgents are present and fire upon us, we will defend ourselves. But we will not enact a sweep. Not tonight." The ragged men hissed and then murmured. The boy in uniform lowered his rifle as if feeling snow melt on his hands. The valley exhaled. Later, after the crowd dispersed and the lamps burned low, Nora and Corrin stood at the edge of the camp, the night breathing around them. The general's face had the look of a man who had done something reckless. He did not look younger. If anything, the incident had shown how the weight of decisions can thin a man. "You risked," he began. "You risked the ledger," Nora said. She had seen that ledger so often she could have drawn it with her eyes closed. "You risked avoiding the truth. What we did in the past, who we were, we can't pretend it can't be recognized in us." Corrin's breath fogged. "You carry Requiem's mark openly," he said. "You have risked reputation, at least." "You carry it too," she said. He looked at his hands as if surprised by the knowledge. "I carry a silence." "What will you do when the inquiry comes?" she asked. "Will you write the clean orders to be placed between the pages of minutes? Or will you be honest about the price of those so-called necessary acts?" Corrin's shadow pulled tight across the ground. "It will be messy," he said. "It will be unpleasant. The ministry will be furious. Men will lose rank. There will be hearings where people say they did what they did for a greater good." "Then let them say it," she said. "Let us bring the ledger to light." They returned to command with the night's events like a secret between them. The inquiry began the next morning. Papers moved, men testified, photographs were taken. Nora's presence at the hearings was a shock to those who had written her off. She spoke not with the hyperbole of a martyr nor with the innocence of someone untouched, but with a clarity that comes from being a small instrument forced into large tasks. She described what she had seen in the past, the logistics of lists and the fever with which people can be convinced to sign away others' lives. Her voice did not rise into zealotry. It sat and counted the costs in simple terms. Corrin watched her from the gallery. Men who had been his peers looked uncertain when the question of Requiem came up. The ministry tried to bury some parts and air others, the way a gardener might move dirt to hide a corpse and then plant something pretty above it. But the more they tried to control the narrative, the more people who had known someone with a mark came forward. A survivor here, a deserter there, an old woman who remembered a laugh and a triangle sketched in the dirt. The ledger would not stay closed. At the climax of the hearings, a witness stepped forward, an old man with calloused fingers. He had been a junior officer in the winter offensive. "We were ordered," he said. "We were told the ends justified the means. We saw things. I kept quiet. I had a family. We all lied for a time, and then we told ourselves the lies were for the country. A memo rolled through the gallery. The minister attempted to broker the narrative, to reframe the actions as necessary tactical decisions, but the public, fed a string of images and a taste for truth, began to ask whether the ledger that had been kept clean by blood and silence was built on a rotten foundation. General Corin spoke on the 10th day. He did not read a statement prepared by someone else's hand. He walked to the microphone and looked at the faces banked in the room like quarters of a city. His voice was not the voice of a man trying to evict culpability from his chest. It was honest in a way that feels shattering because it promises no comfort. We were given orders, he said. We thought that obedience was the only sane path to keep a country from tearing itself apart. We acted because we thought someone must act. For some of us, the act meant salvation. For others, it meant nothing but ruin. I do not ask to be forgiven. I ask only that we accept the truth of our deeds and do our best to account for them. The minister tried to pivot, to inject technocratic calm, but the public, hearing a man of power call himself a man who had done wrong, felt something they had not expected. Relief, the small comfort of being told the truth about what had been done in their names. In the weeks that followed, policies were reformed with painful slowness. Those implicated in illegal operations were retired, demoted, and in some cases brought to trial. The ministry cleaned its offices like a house after a serious sickness. Nora returned to the supply depot, but things were different. People who had once folded their eyes at her now studied her, curious, deferent, a little ashamed. Elias stayed. He had been a stabilizing presence throughout the hearings, an anchor. Mara, who had looked at Nora with worship in her earlier days, began to ask the hard questions of the paperwork she might one day sign. The world was not suddenly kind. Such transformations never are, but the processes of scrutiny and the exposure of a ledger's dirty pages shifted the axis of what people could expect from each other. One evening, months later, General Corin came to the depot. The rain had returned as if to wash the city clean. Nora turned a crate, the small ritual of work grounding her. She did not expect visitors. He stopped at her workbench and did not speak for a moment. Up close, he had the look of a man scaled down by time and guilt and then patched up with the authority that had always been his. You could have used other weapons, he said finally. You could have made the mark a secret and used it as leverage. You could have disappeared when this started. She paused. The ink on her arm glinted faintly. I could have, she said, but I wanted to be seen. He looked at the tattoo as if tasting an old memory. I remember someone else with a mark, he said. There was a fatigue in his voice now, not the bright, sharp sort, but the quiet erosion of a stone left in a stream. I remember a girl who drew a triangle on her thumb to hide a scar. I thought I had lost her forever. You lost many things, Nora said. She did not say his name. He nodded. I thought I had to keep faith with the ledger, he said. That was my sin. You're not the only one, she said. We all have ledgers. Some of us put the names on the page. Some of us live with them. The important thing is that the pages are visible now. He let out a breath, a small laugh that held sorrow. You carried Requiem like a brand. You turned a tool into a conscience. She smiled. The smile was brittle and warm like the edge of a coin. I was labeled Deadweight when I couldn't stand like the others, she said. But perhaps the world needs Deadweight sometimes. Perhaps the world needs people who will not be useful in the way it expects, because they can see what the ledger hides. Corin watched her as if measuring the future on the plane of her face. What will you do now? Teach, she said without hesitation. Tell the truth. Help the young people learn what obedience can cost. Make them write their own ledgers. He nodded, a simple movement that carried the weight of a man learning the value of small things. The rain tapped the depot's roof. Mara walked by with a stack of manifests and dropped one into Nora's hands with a grin like a child's. Elias winked from behind a crate. Outside, the city was a messy thing, full of lives that could not be reduced to a ledger and a seal. Inside, Nora flexed her ankle and felt strength where she had been told there was weakness. The little triangle on her forearm caught the light, a small constellation that had once promised killing and had now become a map. General Corin placed his hand lightly on the crate beside her, a gesture not of command but of solidarity. You saved them, he said, voice low. No, she said. We did. You did. We all did. He looked at her with a new kind of respect, not unearned and not blind. Then keep telling the story, he said. Tell it so loud that the ledger can't be rewritten in silence. She nodded. The mark on her arm felt less like a sentence and more like a story's punctuation, a pause that allowed something to be said. When he left, the depot felt warmer somehow, the way a cleared house warms after the sun comes through the windows. Night folded itself in. The city's garland of lights winked awake like small promises. Somewhere a child laughed, a small bell sound that passed through Nora's ribs and softened the places where pain had once lodged. She traced the triangle on her arm with a fingertip, and the ink seemed to answer, small, indelible, and not all of what she had been. Labels are heavy things until they are shed, she thought. Then they become objects like any other, tools, perhaps, to be used with care. Outside, far up the valley where tents had once stood like fragile planets, people packed and lifted and moved. They traveled under orders that had become, impossibly, kinder. The ledger would not fully erase itself. Memory had edges. But the names that filled it were no longer only numbers. They were people who could be spoken of without the furnace of euphemism. They were visible. And for the first time in a long while, Nora allowed herself to imagine a life unmeasured by output and utility, a life that began not with a label but with a choice. She would keep the mark, because some scars teach you how to see. She would teach the young to read ledgers and to make better ones. She would, perhaps, stitch seams for people who had none. The general's silhouette dwindled in the rain-silvered distance. For once, he did not carry himself like a man who had closed his heart to keep the wheel running. He carried it, instead, like a man who had opened it and let the world in. The tattoo on Nora's arm was a small thing, a K*LL code in the old language of bodies and orders. To those who had been told they were deadweight, it meant something else entirely now. Proof that a label could be challenged, a ledger could be opened, and a general could freeze, and then unfreeze, when faced with the undeniable truth of another human skin.